Where are you coming from tonight?
From work, sir. Just left the diner after a long shift.
Do you have anything in the vehicle I should know about?
No, sir, and I do not consent to any searches.
Red and blue lights flashing in a rearview mirror do not just signal a routine traffic stop. Sometimes they are the blinding warning signs that your constitutional rights are about to become a matter of personal opinion. For Marcus, a 10-year Marine Corps veteran, the moment those lights fractured the darkness of the wet U.S. highway, the atmosphere inside his car shifted from mundane quiet to dangerously unpredictable. The night had started innocently enough. The rhythmic, heavy thrum of rain against the large plate glass windows of a 24-hour diner provided the backdrop to a late-night meal. Marcus sat across from David, his co-worker and longtime friend. The two men were logistics managers at a regional freight hub. Coming off a brutal 14-hour shift, the diner smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and fried grease. The ambient clatter of thick ceramic mugs hitting formica tables and the distant, muffled voices of tired waitresses created a comforting white noise. Marcus was a man carved from discipline. His posture was invariably straight, his movements deliberate and measured, a lingering artifact of his time in the infantry. He wore a simple olive drab jacket, his eyes quietly scanning the room with passive vigilance. David, by contrast, was a bundle of nervous energy, a man who spoke with his hands and perpetually checked his phone, anxious to get home to his young daughter. They were just two exhausted men existing in the quiet liminal space between a long workday and a warm bed. When they stepped out into the biting October air, the rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle. The tires of Marcus's late model dark blue SUV hissed against the slick asphalt as they pulled out of the diner's parking lot. The road was nearly empty, illuminated only by the rhythmic passing of amber streetlights that cast long, fleeting shadows inside the cabin. Marcus drove exactly the speed limit, his hands resting easily at the 10 and 2 position. He was not a man who invited chaos into his life, but chaos, particularly in the form of unexamined bias, does not wait for an invitation. Less than 2 miles down the road, the aggressive glare of headlights filled the cabin, followed instantly by the stark, strobing flash of police light bars. The siren gave a short, authoritative chirp. David flinched. His hand immediately dropping to his lap, Marcus simply checked his mirrors, activated his right turn signal, and pulled smoothly into the brightly lit canopy of a closed gas station. He shifted the vehicle into park, turned off the engine, and removed the keys, placing them clearly on the center dashboard. He pressed the buttons to roll down all 4 windows, letting the damp, chilly air flood the warm interior. Next, he turned on the overhead dome light. David's breathing grew shallow and audible over the sound of the rain. He started to reach toward the glove compartment. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. Low, calm, and perfectly steady. He told David to stop moving, to place his hands flat on his knees, and to keep them there. In a situation governed by adrenaline and assumptions, Marcus knew that sudden movements were the currency of tragedy. Behind them, the door of the police cruiser groaned open. Heavy boots crunched against the wet pavement. Through the side mirror, Marcus watched the silhouette of a large, broad-shouldered man approaching the driver's side, while a second, younger officer hung back near the rear passenger quarter panel. The approaching man was Chief Robert Holden, a 30-year veteran of the local department. Holden was a relic of an older era of policing, a man who prided himself on his gut instincts and his ability to read a situation. But a gut instinct is often just unacknowledged bias wearing a badge. Holden had spent decades working under the assumption that out-of-place elements meant criminal intent. In his mind, a brand new, expensive SUV driven by 2 men of color at 2 a.m. in a working class industrial sector of town did not add up to logistics managers coming off a late shift. To Holden's deeply ingrained, subtle prejudices, it looked like drug movement or a stolen vehicle. He had received a vague dispatch 30 minutes earlier about a dark-colored SUV fleeing a residential burglary 3 towns over. It was a flimsy thread, but for a man looking to validate his suspicions, it was enough. Holden's flashlight beam pierced the darkness, sweeping aggressively across Marcus's face, momentarily blinding him, before darting to David and finally settling on the steering wheel where Marcus's hands rested completely open. The heavy, metallic static of Holden's shoulder radio broke the silence. Sputtering fragmented codes, Holden did not offer a greeting. His voice was gravelly, carrying the weary but absolute authority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. He demanded a driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Marcus did not immediately move his hands. He spoke with the measured, neutral cadence he had used countless times to de-escalate terrified recruits and agitated locals overseas. He stated clearly that his license was in his back right pocket and the registration was in the glove box in front of his passenger. He asked for permission to reach for them. Holden's eyes narrowed. The explicit request for permission, the perfect procedural compliance, did not put the chief at ease. Instead, it triggered his suspicion. In Holden's worldview, people who knew the rules this well were usually trying to hide something. He gave a curt nod. Marcus slowly retrieved his wallet, keeping his movements smooth and broadcasted. He then asked David to slowly open the glove box. David's hands were shaking violently. As the latch popped, a stack of napkins spilled out, fluttering to the floorboard. David let out a nervous, breathless apology. Reaching down quickly to grab them, Holden's hand instantly dropped to the retention hood of his holster. He shouted a command to freeze, his voice echoing off the metal canopy of the gas station. The younger officer at the rear of the car immediately unholstered his weapon, holding it at the low ready. The atmosphere in the car evaporated into pure, suffocating terror. David Frozet, suspended over the floorboard, a napkin crumpled in his trembling fingers. Marcus did not raise his voice, but the commanding timbre of his tone shifted, carrying a heavy, immovable weight. He told the officer that his passenger was just picking up a napkin, that there were no weapons in the vehicle, and that both of their hands were visible. Holden stepped closer to the window, invading the physical space of the car, his breath visible in the cold air. He demanded to know where they were coming from and where they were going. Marcus answered factually, "The diner, work, going home." Holden listened, but he wasn't really hearing. His mind was already locked onto a predetermined narrative. He looked at the spotless interior of the car, the expensive leather, and back at Marcus's stoic, unyielding expression. Holden decided that the story was a lie. Taking a step back, Holden ordered Marcus to step out of the vehicle. This was the exact moment the legal boundary began to blur, shifting from a lawful investigative stop into a constitutional violation. Under the Fourth Amendment, an officer can order a driver out of a vehicle for officer safety. However, Holden's intention was not safety. He wanted to separate the men, interrogate them, and ultimately search the car. He had already checked the license plates against his onboard computer before approaching. The car was registered to Marcus with no warrants and no history. The original justification for the stop, the vague resemblance to a burglary suspect's vehicle, was rapidly evaporating. Yet, Holden was refusing to let it go. Marcus did not argue the exit order. He unbuckled his seatbelt with a deliberate, slow click, opened the door, and stepped out into the freezing rain. He stood tall, looking directly into Holden's eyes, maintaining a respectful but firm posture. Holden instructed Marcus to face the vehicle and place his hands behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted around Marcus's wrist. The sharp, metallic clicks sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. David watched from the passenger seat, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Marcus asked, evenly, If he was under arrest, Holden replied that he was just being detained while they figured out what was really going on. Holden then stated that he was going to search the vehicle to make sure there were no weapons, leaning heavily on the legal concept of a Terry frisk. But a Terry frisk of a vehicle is strictly limited to the passenger compartment, where a suspect might gain immediate control of a weapon, and it requires reasonable, articulable suspicion that the person is armed and dangerous. Marcus, fully restrained and perfectly compliant, posed no such threat. Marcus stood perfectly still against the wet metal of his car. He spoke clearly, ensuring the younger officer's body camera captured every syllable. He stated unequivocally that he did not consent to any searches of his vehicle. He stated that he had provided his identification, which cleared him of any warrants, and that holding him there without probable cause was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. Holden scoffed with an arrogant, breathy sound. He told Marcus that if he had nothing to hide, he shouldn't mind a quick look. It is the oldest and most manipulative trap in law enforcement, weaponizing a citizen's assertion of their rights as evidence of their guilt. When Marcus repeated his refusal, Holden's subtle bias flared into active frustration. The chief's ego could not handle a civilian, particularly this civilian, dictating the boundaries of the law to him. Holden ignored the refusal. He walked over to the passenger side, ordered a terrified David out of the car, patted him down aggressively, and then leaned directly into the vehicle. Holden began pulling apart the center console, tossing Marcus's personal belongings onto the seats. He checked under the floor mats. He moved to the back seat, unzipping a gym bag. This was no longer a limited protective sweep. It was a full-blown illegal evidentiary search driven entirely by a bruised ego and an unfounded hunch. The minutes dragged on. The rain soaked into Marcus's jacket, chilling him to the bone. But his internal temperature was completely controlled. He was gathering data, memorizing badge numbers, noting the time, and cataloging every procedural misstep Holden was making. Then, the turning point arrived. It did not come with a dramatic shout or a sudden physical altercation. It came as a small, tinny voice cutting through the ambient hum of the rain. From the younger officer's shoulder radio, the dispatch operator's voice crackled. The operator announced that county sheriffs had just apprehended the suspects from the residential burglary on the opposite side of the county. The vehicle recovered was an older model, rusted black hatchback. The audio hung in the air, a heavy, undeniable truth that shattered Holden's entire narrative. The younger officer, Davies, looked down at his radio, then shifted his gaze uncomfortably toward his chief, who was still leaning halfway into the back seat of Marcus's SUV. Davies cleared his throat. Aizitan, nervous sound. He took a step forward and quietly informed the chief that dispatch had just cleared the call. They had the guys. Holden slowly backed out of the vehicle. In the harsh glow of the gas station lights, the realization settled over his features. The absolute certainty he had felt just moments before dissolved into the bitter, acidic taste of a massive procedural failure. He stood holding a pair of Marcus's gym shoes, looking utterly foolish. There were no drugs. There were no stolen goods. There was just a man going home from work, standing in the rain in handcuffs, watching the chief of police illegally rifle through his life. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was the sound of authority, realizing it had overstepped, struggling to find a way to retreat without surrendering its pride. Holden dropped the shoes back onto the seat and slammed the door shut. He did not apologize. Men whose identities are built on always being right rarely know how to say they are wrong. He walked over to Marcus, his movements stiff and defensive. He unlocked the handcuffs, muttering a half-hearted excuse about keeping the streets safe and doing his job. He handed Marcus back his license and registration, unable to meet the veteran's eye. Marcus brought his hands to the front of his body, rubbing his wrists where the steel had bitten into his skin. He did not yell. He did not curse. He simply looked at Holden his gaze piercing and relentlessly steady, and asked for the chief's card. Holden hesitated, his jaw tight, before pulling a damp card from his front pocket and handing it over. Without another word, Marcus motioned for David to get back in the car. They drove away, leaving the two officers standing in the rain beneath the fluorescent lights, the flashing red and blues now seeming less like a symbol of authority and more like a beacon of their failure. The aftermath of that night did not unfold like a movie. There was no instant justice, no immediate dramatic firing or tearful confession. The real world moves at the agonizingly slow pace of bureaucracy. The following morning, Marcus filed a formal, meticulously documented complaint with Internal Affairs, attaching his own dashcam audio and requesting the release of the officer's body camera footage. He cited specific case law detailing the exact moment the Terry stop morphed into an unconstitutional search. He leveraged his meticulous military training to dismantle the chief's flimsy narrative for weeks. Nothing seemed to happen, but the wheels of accountability, once properly engaged, grind down even the most entrenched stone. When the footage was eventually reviewed by an independent municipal oversight board, the evidence was undeniable. The video captured Holden's dismissive tone, the illegal expansion of the search, and the crucial moment he ignored the dispatch audio. It laid bare the subtle but devastating reality of policing based on assumption rather than evidence. Chief Holden was not immediately fired, but he was quietly placed on administrative leave. The story leaked to local news outlets, stripping away the veneer of his untouchable local legacy. His career ended not with a grand, honorable retirement, but with a quiet, disgraced resignation to avoid a protracted civil rights lawsuit. The younger officer, Davius, was sent back to the academy for mandatory retraining on constitutional boundaries, forever marked by the lesson he learned standing in the rain that night. Marcus and David continued to work their long shifts. They continued to stop at the diner, but the invisible scars of the encounter remained. They drove with a hyper-vigilance of men who had been shown unequivocally that the law is only as strong as the integrity of the person enforcing it. When we give individuals the power to strip away freedom on the side of a dark road, we must ask ourselves, are we trusting them to uphold the law? Or are we simply giving them permission to enforce their own assumptions? True justice requires more than a badge. It requires the humility to know when you are wrong and the courage to admit that the law protects the citizens from the state, not the other way around.